Want to listen to this Ivory Tower Boiler Room episode and all of our Ivory Tower Boiler Room episodes ad free? Head to our Patreon, patreon.com. That's patreon.com/ Ivory Tower Boiler Room for $5 a month. You get all of our ad free episodes, our video interviews, and our bonus episodes. See you there. And I find that those in the fitness industry, I am close to, like, whether they be fitness influencers or trainers, they are asking all these questions, but it's not with that same language. It's the language of, oh, okay, well, do the activity that motivates you, right? Like you hear this word a lot about
Yes.
motivation. Hi, this is Andrew, and I'm interrupting what I know is an exciting ITBR episode to talk to you about one of our sponsors, the Gay and Lesbian Review. Discover new things about gay and lesbian literature, history, and culture with a subscription to the Gay and Lesbian Review, a bi monthly magazine of history, culture, and politics that publishes essays in a wide range of disciplines, as well as a slew of reviews of books, plays, and movies and a number of special features, such as artist profiles and our popular art memo column. Each issue of the Gay and Lesbian Review brings you consistently intelligent, lively, thought provoking articles focused on a unifying theme, and it brings together the leading minds on the topic. You won't find a lot about the latest dating fads or fashion trends, but you will definitely find articles about online dating, like using Grindr as a social phenomenon, or even the gay influence on 20th century fashion. Did you know that I've actually interviewed 3 gay and lesbian review contributors? Make sure you listen to my Ignacio Darnad Breaking the Gay Code in Art episode, where Ignacio explains that key artistic figures like Michelangelo, Donatello, Thomas Eakins, J.C. Leyendecker, and Thomas Finland all have really explicit homoerotic artwork. And then head on over to the next episode where I talk with Dr. Vernon Rosario about LGBTQ psychiatry and how homosexuality got depathologized. And our most recent episode was with the Gay and Lesbian Review's literary editor, Martha E. Stone, and she talks about what LGBTQ literature you should be reading this summer, and also how to become a contributing writer and a reviewer for the Gay and Lesbian Review. To subscribe, visit glreview.org. That's glreview.org. Click subscribe and enter the promo code ITBR to receive a free copy with any print or digital subscription. And as an added bonus, you also receive online access to all of the Gay and Lesbian Review's archived issues. All of them. Okay, enjoy your reading, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. This is officially now our summer season. And I thought, what better way than to not only feature Broadview Press and one of their recent editions that came out. We love Broadview Press here, but also talk all things summer sports. It seems relevant in the outdoor culture that everyone is faced with in the summer. Unless you're opposed to the sun. So not everyone wants to be outside. I get it. But I'm so excited to be joined with my guest here. I was joking with him that he is our first quote unquote PhD, literal doctor of philosophy, that he actually studies philosophy, writes about philosophy. So Jason Holt is joining me here, and he's at Acadia University in Nova Scotia. Well, I think it's in Nova Scotia. Um, yes, it's in Nova Scotia, and he also got his PhD from University of Western Ontario. So a true Canadian man here. He is interested in aesthetics, its nature, its role in human psychology, its diverse expressions in arts, sports, and popular culture. We'll get into all of that, especially the sports and the arts element of aesthetics. His book Phonetic Beauty, The Philosophical Aesthetics of Sport, published by Routledge. In 2019, won the Faculty of Professional Studies Outstanding Research Project Award. And we're here to also focus on his book that's in its second edition from Broadview Press called The Philosophy of Sport. So, without further ado, here is Jason. Hi, Jason.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Of course. Well, so right away, I mean, already studying a PhD, I know, as this comes out now on the other side of it, since I defended my PhD in July. So, you know,
Congratulations.
thank you. But it's in English. So even though it's a doctor of philosophy, I'm in the humanities. But what I'm just curious with, especially when I talk to philosophers, is in my opinion, it's such an intriguing field to go into, especially with the public's stereotype of its language, its jargon, its um, what theoretical arguments you're going to be intervening in. Um, and where were you first introduced to, say, quote unquote, philosophy as a field of study?
Right here at the very institution where I teach. As an undergraduate, I took an introduction to philosophy course here. I think it was in my second year. This is back in the early 90s. And I just fell in love with it right away. And so I changed my major. I was in the sciences at the time. And I just loved doing it and stuck with it ever since in one form or another. I had read some philosophy prior to that. My father had an interest in an old English philosopher named Bertrand Russell, old as in early to mid
Hmm.
20th century. So it wasn't entirely foreign to me. He'd also given me some existentialist work to read, both literary fiction and philosophical work. And so it all kind of came together when I was an undergraduate.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because in high school, I remember very vividly my Western history course, the ancient Greek component, and we did read the allegory of the cave. And that to me was my entrance. So I quote that as what sparked my interest in ancient Greek culture and literature. I use Plato's Symposium in my work and a lot of ancient Greek philosophy in terms of homoeroticism. So I'm more, you know, approaching it from that angle. But I did take well, I didn't take it. I was going to audit a phenomenology course, and then realized I was the only PhD student not in philosophy, and I heard all this language, and I'm thinking, did I just enter a scene where I needed uh prior knowledge? It was just, and it can feel that way, right? Like that you need to have unlocked the code of language in order to understand, right? Phenomenology at its base for everyone out there who's like, what is it? Just because I don't want to do that to the audience, and hide the language from them. But I mean, in my opinion, phenomenology is just the study of perception or how objects or how we interact with our senses. I mean, is that pretty at its base what it is?
Yeah, that's a good characterization. In philosophy, people who would call themselves phenomenologists would add to that typically the element of embodiment. So it's not just a
Mhm.
disembodied consciousness or perceiver that we're talking about, but some agent very much centered in a body, in space and time with a certain context and orientation and so on. And that informs and lays the groundwork for perception
Mm.
and self-understanding. So yeah, I think that's a good basic characterization, but you're definitely right about the negative stereotype of philosophy not only being widespread out there as something where you need a whole bunch of technical jargon even to enter the conversation and to understand what's going on, but the fact that many people, when exposed to philosophy, find that negative stereotype confirmed. And that's partly our fault as philosophers, where most of us very good at talking amongst ourselves And some of us have tried to change the discourse a little bit to allow other people from outside the discipline to access the discourse and participate, because talking with just philosophers can get tiresome after a while. Talking with people with different interests, academic and otherwise,
Mhm.
that's really where it's at.
Yeah, there's a book called Queer Phenomenology. I'm not sure if you've read it, but it's by Sarah Ahmed, and um, she comes from women's gender sexuality studies, and I just love those intersections. But I'm glad you brought us there, Jason, because the work you do is so it's full of intersectionality. It's full of like sports. I mean, there's sports marketing, right? There's other elements that a university would look at questions around sport and culture. But when you're looking into aesthetic, right? And like, can you give everyone here listening for aesthetics? I mean, taking us back to ancient Greek culture, I always think of aesthetic philosophy and what Plato says about the ideal in the symposium. Um, and that they were so interested in the gymnasium in ancient Greek
Mm-hmm.
culture. And so it's interesting, like you talked about embodiment, but bodies were fully on display in this elite ancient Greek philosophical community. Like it wasn't disembodied. It was, your physical activity was part of how you were gaining knowledge.
Yeah, and part of a well-rounded person's existence, you develop your intellectual capacities, your physical capacities, different social skills, and that was the way of learning the different virtues, becoming a good citizen, becoming a good person, a full, well-rounded person. Somehow in Western philosophy, since the ancient Greeks and Romans to a certain extent as well, people neglected the body from a theoretical perspective in many ways. And only in the last few decades have we come to realize that that was a real loss and sought to integrate, not just in terms of experience, but theoretically, philosophically, our embodiment with our understanding of our own intellect and the way we see the world and what we value.
Do you think that that was an academic Um, I mean, it's like a chicken or the egg. I'm not trying to do a cause and effect scenario, but do you think there was a push, especially in literary studies? Roland Barthes had proclaimed the death of the author, even though biographical criticism flourishes and biographies to the public are consumed um voraciously. I mean, whenever there's a new biography of, say, even Anna Wintour, I mean, that is such a spectacle because you don't really get to learn about um, the psyche of a person. And like biography is so fascinating. But like as a scholar, there was such a push in the 20th. And I think now we're seeing it breaking away where you were supposed to be quote unquote objective in your analysis
Mm-hmm.
and like you were supposed to maintain that objectivity and like to put Jason Holt into his work like was cautioned against like that we're not influenced by what we're studying
Mm-hmm.
you know
Hey, Ivory Tower Boiler Room listeners and true crime friends. You've heard me gush over this incredible woman and her beautiful products. I'm talking about Mandy Made It. Mandy makes customized and original crochet and pre-cut goods. They are the perfect, unique, one-of-a-kind gift for literally anyone in your life. And she makes incredible home decor. I still have my pumpkins that I put out every fall. I just love them. Check her out on Instagram at MANDEE Made It or search Mandy Made It on Facebook. To order, just slide into her DMs, and if you mention the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, you will receive a free personalized gift with your first order. So, go on Instagram and look up at Mandy Made It, and Mandy is spelled Mandee. Again, her handle is at Mandy Made It, Mandy spelled Mandee, and order today.
Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and I am so excited to be talking to you all about Broadview Press. Broadview Press is an independent academic publisher in the humanities that produces high quality, pedagogically useful books for use in university and college classrooms. They publish in the humanities, mainly English studies, writing, philosophy, and history, just to name a few genres. So you might be asking, okay, Andrew, have we heard any Broadview Press authors? And the answer is yes. You actually right now are listening to a Broadview Press author. Dr. Jason Holt's book, The Philosophy of Sport, is published by Broadview Press. So make sure that you use Broadview Press's exclusive Ivory Tower Boiler Room discount code. It is Ivory Tower. Go to broadviewpress.com and order Jason's book, Philosophy of Sport. And if you haven't, make sure that you listen to the spring episode with doctors Kyle Stedman and Tanya Rodriguez, who wrote all about sound writing and making your own audio projects, including how to make podcasts, which I know a lot of you out there asked me about how to make your own podcasts. Listen to that episode from the spring. Dr. Jeffrey Weinstock in the winter, he talked all about pop culture for beginners and also about how to teach composition. And he uses this really fun horror gothic metaphor of being a mad scientist in the composition classroom. And in the fall, yes, the university season is upon us soon. Dr. Ann Stevens talked about literary theory and criticism and dissects what does literary theory actually mean. I love Broadview Press. It means so much to have them as a sponsor here. And like I said, use that exclusive 20% off code Ivory Tower for all of your literature orders. Broadviewpress.com. Follow them on Instagram. And can't wait for you all to hear the next Broadview Press interview.
Yeah, it's an interesting related point. I see it as related but distinguishable. And I've written on this question of interpretation and to what extent an artist's, specifically an author's intentions, need to be known or inferred or taken account of in interpreting their work. And it's interesting that if you focus on the text, you get this sense of objectivity, but so too if you do an objective psychological inquiry into what the author or more broadly artist seems to have intended. It's not like that's not objective, but, and I think Barth was right to this extent, it can be limiting because artists aren't always the best judge of what they're doing or what they're succeeding in doing in the works they create. Sometimes the work is much better than the artist meant it to be, even though that sounds kind of paradoxical. So I understand the push from people like Barth to say that the author is dead. That's a bit of hyperbole and polemic, but the idea that we're not necessarily beholden to the author's intentions, that we might be able to read significance into work beyond what the author intended as a way of being charitable to the work and its significance, and to, in a way, indirectly to the author themselves.
Yeah, well, and thank you. That's so well put. And I know, like, the work that you're doing, especially, so aesthetics, when people hear that, they think of beauty, right? Like, usually in marketing campaigns, aesthetic gets thrown around, and it's always supposed to be in terms of the body. But there's more to it than that, right? Like, what, if you had to provide an elevator pitch definition of aesthetics, Jason, what would that, how would you explain it even to your students?
There are two important components: realizing that aesthetics is a subfield in philosophy. So aesthetics is the philosophy of art and beauty, or more broadly, things that are aesthetically appealing. And it's interesting that you would bring up the ordinary sense of aesthetics and what makes for an attractive or appealing body, because philosophers tend to distinguish what they would call the agreeable from the aesthetically pleasing. So a person who is attractive, who maybe appeals to you from an erotic point of view, we might distinguish that sort of personal interest from a more distanced aesthetic appreciation. We can aesthetically appreciate things which are disagreeable, as when we watch a horror film, say, or see a painting of something horrific. Some of Goya's paintings, for instance, are awful, but we say, oh yeah, this is a worthwhile experience. So from a philosophical standpoint, aesthetics is about getting at those pleasing experiences that aren't necessarily tied to biology, but maybe in interesting ways, but go beyond and potentially engage a more detached intellectual appreciation.
Mm.
But
So,
there are different
yeah.
theories there.
Yeah. Well, and what you're doing, I know there's two schools of thought, and I mean, thought might not be the right word, but isn't there two branches of philosophy nowadays, or when they're in a university system? You can go into, I'm trying to remember, there's the more like
Are you thinking,
quantitative type
yeah,
of
are you
philosophy.
thinking analytic versus
Yes.
continental?
Thank you. Thank you. Analytic versus continental.
Yeah, that is a big distinction, a big divide, and it has been there for at least 100 years, 150 years. And I think the better philosophers, just as they try to engage people who aren't necessarily in philosophy, would also try to engage people from other disciplinary fields within philosophy. So the best analytic philosophy is well written and would be more accessible and appealing to continental authors, and vice versa, with appropriate changes. So the best continental philosophy, some tends to be obscure, but the best stuff tends to be more accessible to people with an analytic background. So the analytic philosophers, and I was trained there, are into logic and analyzing language from a very logical standpoint, whereas continental philosophy is more, this is a caricature, of course, but more interested in exploring associations and connotations, and the language is often very obscure and difficult. Barth, for instance, is a continental philosopher, but I, as an analytic philosopher, can appreciate some of the important things he's saying or seems to be saying about interpretation in his work. So I'd like to think that this distinction between the logical analytics and the associative continentals is being bridged, and that eventually it won't be much of a meaningful distinction anymore. But that's just a hope.
Yeah. Well, and then you could have someone like Noam Chomsky, right, who's a linguist, but also like is a linguist philosopher, or right, like you're saying, there's a lot of fields that start to now they're connecting with each other. There's so much, like you could be a philosopher of literature, for
Mm-hmm.
example. But I mean, going into the sports element, like what were you always drawn to questions around? Is it the viewers of sports? Is it the participants of sports? Like how these communities, I mean, you write so poignantly on virtual gaming communities, and I find that fascinating as well. Like, are these all questions that had been brewing even before you went into your PhD studies? Like you were drawn to it?
Actually, no. I've been interested in aesthetics since, let's say, my early 20s, but then following the standard academic philosophy route before I got this job in kinesiology, which is the study of human movement, before I picked up the philosophy of sport as something I taught or did research in, I had done a lot of sport as a child, as youth, teenager, and so on. But then the academic pursuits kind of took over, and I, almost mirroring the history of Western philosophy itself, sort of neglected the body for a while. And then when I got this job teaching philosophy of sport in kinesiology, that came back to the fore, and I started integrating. And it seemed the more I could integrate my theoretical interests with one another and with my practical experience and exposure to different types of skill, physical and otherwise, the better. So Now it seems to be the right thing for me to do would be that which allows me to integrate my experience and my theoretical interests. And it's all coming together in an interesting way. So I did aesthetics for years, but then when I started doing philosophy of sport, I found that there was a lot of untapped potential for exploring the overlap there. Some work had been done, but it was subject to some to some kind of critique, at least to an outsider like me, as I was then. And there were lots of unexplored avenues as well. So you mentioned the distinction between viewers and participants. Almost everyone, until fairly recently in the philosophy of sport, specifically dealing with aesthetics, sport aesthetics, focused on viewers, what's appealing for a viewer. But then with recent work in phenomenology, embodied aesthetics, people are looking at the athlete's experience as potentially aesthetic too. And if you have any kind of background in skilled physical activity in sport or dance or martial arts or what have you, you recognize that there can be a real aesthetic there. Once you've perfected a skill and honed a skill and executed perfectly under pressure, that's a beautiful thing. Not because you did it, but because of the kind of skill it is.
Mm.
So I actually came to it late. I had these diverse interests, and then at a certain point, they meshed in an interesting way.
Oh, it's fascinating the way you're describing your journey to this inquiry, because for the longest time, I always, as an, undergrad into my PhD work, would always like discover, especially my interest was in, I mean, my whole work is really centered on homoerotic poetics, but when I was journeying to this, I discovered work on like LGBTQ sports, and it was mostly all social science, specifically sociology related. And a lot of it was so college focused, which makes sense because sociologists rely on sample studies. And who are those sample studies but college students, because they're there in access? And the questions became limiting in a way. Like you can only get so far when it's a specific subset, where I was always more like I was interested in, okay, but how about when we're talking about sporting culture and coming out in mainstream sports, like specifically the NFL or the NBA. And I know more work is being done, but the questions that a sociologist asks is going to be very different than, I mean, not very different, but there's a different way that they're trying to do qualitative studies. So like what is the difference, would you say, Jason, and like what a sociologist would do in terms of looking at sporting culture compared to say what you're more interested in, or like what question you're trying to answer?
Okay. Now, I'm not an expert in sociology, but I do have a kind of dime store way of distinguishing the two. So sociology would be interested in things from a social perspective, almost purely, almost as if the ideal sociological study had nothing to do with what people were thinking, except as reported in surveys and represented in statistical trends and things like that. Some assumptions wouldn't be questioned. Some interesting phenomena, like what's going on a psychological level here? Do we have some kind of unconscious bias being confirmed or expressed in these behaviors, etc.? That would be more of interest to philosophers and psychologists too. Philosophers would want to get at the underpinnings of all these phenomena. And in fact, in kinesiology, when you do philosophy of sport and physical activity, you get to run the gamut in a way between, because kinesiology is this multidisciplinary enterprise which goes from applied physiology all the way through to applied philosophy, and you get all these different perspectives that you can integrate. So I think that's a bit of a hand wavy answer, but it's part of it. sociologist is very socially focused, and philosophers would be focused on other things, such as the metaphysics, the epistemology, so theory of knowledge, philosophy of psychology, what's going on in the mind, that sort of thing. A sociologist might be interested in why performance-enhancing drugs are used in a certain sport culture, maybe why that's on the rise, but a philosopher might be interested in whether it's right or wrong to have the bans on performance-enhancing drugs in those sports as we have them, whether they should be relaxed, whether they should be modified or eliminated outright.
LGBT stories are universal, but each one speaks to the individual heart and soul of the writer telling it. Do you have a story to tell? Or have you been moved recently by an LGBT book, film, painting, television show, or other form of media? Then the Gay and Lesbian Review wants to hear from you. The GNLR believes in bringing awareness to queer art and artists through reviews, commentary, and thought pieces in which the author relates their personal lives to a particular piece of art, a novel, a movie, or what have you. In addition to the print magazine, the GNLR also publishes articles on its blog as well as personal essays on its popular Here's My Story section on glreview.org. That's glreview.org. To learn more about submitting an article for the GNLR, visit their writer's guidelines. The link is located at the bottom of the homepage. And if you have any questions, email publisher Stephen Hemrick. That's STEPHEN.HEMRICK at glreview.org. The GNLR and its readers can't wait to see what you have to say.
So there are certain value questions and certain questions of the metaphysical basis, the reality of things, that would be of less interest to sociologists than to philosophers.
Yeah, and I mean, the ethics that are asked in philosophy of sport. I mean, for everyone out there, it's this just, you call it this mesomorphic book, which I just love this phrase, this word, this, you know, compound word that has been thrown out there and almost like a mosaic of sorts. But all of the scholars who weigh in, it's fascinating because a lot are bringing up ethical questions. And that was helping me realize, okay, it's you're trying to weigh in on a debate. And you're right, a sociologist, for the most part, they're showing what's happening. Like they're presenting the social situation, right? And you laid that out wonderfully. And I do find that when I've read a social scientist who experiments in their writing, who like makes creative leaps, that there's a lot of backlash. I mean, they're the writers I really like because I think I'm so literary minded that I love those imaginative leaps or
Mm-hmm.
thinking about embodiment and creativity. Like, for example, there's this book called um, The Tragedy of Heterosexuality by Jane Ward. And she like looks at how LGBTQ life, there's a lot of upsides, and maybe we should be questioning how limiting heterosexuality is. And right, so like there is a philosophical question there. And she also, though, isn't seen as purely a sociologist, but I don't like that term purely any discipline, right? And that's
Right,
something you're bringing up here. Like, you would never say you're purely a philosopher, or what does that even mean?
right, right. Yeah,
Um, yeah.
there's something limiting about that. And that's at the root of the idea that one shouldn't be defined or want to be defined. There's nothing wrong with definitions. There's nothing wrong with descriptions, but it can be taken as limiting in a problematic way to say you're purely this or purely that. I agree 100%. That's a great title, The Tragedy of Heterosexuality. I love that. In philosophy, you do those imaginative leaps too, and yet you try to tie it in, at least from an analytic perspective, to some sort of logical argument. So you might imagine some fanciful world in which all the problems we currently face are solved. So we imagine what a utopia would be like. And we think, well, what would we do if we didn't have any problems to solve? Would we play games a lot of the time? Maybe we would. This is Bernard Suits's line that game playing would be an essential component of a utopian existence. And that's the sort of thing philosophers would do for the sake of drawing out some sort of logical implication about the importance of games, in this case, in life as we know it.
Yeah. So, like, one question that your book was really like, when I say your book, your edited collection, but still, Jason's name is on there, and he participates with writing in it. But there really is a such. There was a question I was produced for me, which is this line of thinking of, is the like activity that one does, um say you're doing a spin class, or this is all coming from my own experience. So when I spin, when I feel the rush of the water when I'm swimming, and how my mind clears because I'm not listening to music, like there's something about swimming where you really have to be present. And but any of these cardio experiences, running outside, seeing the nature, seeing the water, the beach, taking in those moments. But when you're in a virtual setting, you're part of a community, but it is different, right? It's a different, when your body isn't fully, your body is not being um accessed the same way when you're in a virtual setting. So I find that must be a really interesting dynamic to that your book brings up, with all of these scholars weighing in on what does it feel like when you're in a virtual scenario compared to, say, when you're present in your body in a vigorous run.
And I like how you're bringing out the contrast too, that there are pros and cons to both. So during the pandemic, virtual connectivity was really important. And so people being part of such communities, even when it comes to physical activity, was paramount importance. Yet there's a difference and seemingly an impoverishment relative to real world, fully immersed in the environment activity, as you describe. So a lot of it is contextual, and a lot of it's going to vary by individual taste. So I like doing cardio too. I don't like doing it outside. I love being outside. I love going on walks. I love going on hikes, but I'd rather just do the cardio on a treadmill or a stationary bike or something. And that frees my mind in maybe a different way, a less immersive way, but I still recognize and seek the value of these other more environmentally outgoing experiences. So, and a lot of people, I should say some pundits anyway, would want to prescribe a one-size-fits-all model for everyone in every context. And I think that's generally a mistake. And people are starting to realize that that kind of one-size-fits-all model is a mistake. I don't think you're wrong to prefer running outside, and I don't think I'm wrong to prefer running on a treadmill.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then it's weather conditional. So sometimes
Yeah.
I do a different activity. Like I might go more for that swim inside at my gym and not go on the treadmill because I'm not a huge fan of running on the treadmill. Like my runs take place outside. So then like I'm switching up what activity based on um the weather, based on my schedule, based on, do I want to be
Based,
in a group class
yeah,
scenario, which
right. But yeah,
is different.
based on your injury status. If you've
Hmm.
hurt a joint or something, you're probably not going to run. You might do something a little less high impact. You might do an elliptical or whatever.
Yeah, and you're right. It's not a one size fits all. It's not that's right, that's wrong. And it's something that where I feel there's so many without what I love about philosophy as a study, but just any kind of unlocking the nuances of like what does sport mean or what does working out mean. Hi, everyone. This is Andrew, and I am interrupting what I know is such an exciting Ivory Tower Boiler Room episode to tell you all about one of my favorite podcasts. It's called That Old Gay Classic Cinema, and it's hosted by Christian Garcia. Christian is joined with guest co hosts to talk about classic cinema films that we know and love, and he analyzes them through a queer lens. So he's talked about The Sound of Music, Alfred Hitchcock, The Wizard of Oz, Sleeping Beauty, 101 Dalmatians, and recently Hello, Dolly. I actually was on his first ever episode to talk about my love of The Sound of Music and playing Captain Von Trapp in my high school musical. Then I was joined with Mary DePippi, the host of True Crime in Academia, and our friend Travis Roundtree to talk about Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. Mary just had Christian on True Crime in Academia to talk about female poisoners, including the evil queen from Snow White and actual real life female poisoners. So, Christian's podcast is the best. You must add it to your listen list. After you listen to this episode, make sure you head over to That Old Gay Classic Cinema on Apple and Spotify. Make sure you follow him on Instagram at That Old Gay Classic Cinema. And he's also on TikTok. Don't forget TikTok. Okay, I can't wait for you all to listen to That Old Gay Classic Cinema. And now back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And I find that those in the fitness industry, I am close to, like, whether they be fitness influencers or trainers, they are asking all these questions, but it's not with that same language. It's the language of, oh, okay, well, do the activity that motivates you, right? Like you hear this word a lot about
Yes.
motivation. And that to me is personal interest. That's your preference. Like you just brought up, what are you latching onto as a preference? That is a
Mm-hmm.
philosophical phenomenon, is the motivation experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could see how influencers and others who are genuinely interested in helping people be healthier, more active, lead more vibrant, fuller lives would be tapping into that. Maybe not with the same terminology, maybe not with the same abstract interest. They just want to get people moving, more active, healthier. And that's great. So everyone has these presuppositions. Philosophers try to be a little more explicit about what the presuppositions are and whether they're legitimate or maybe biased in some ways, and how to sort all that out. But I'm glad that the culture is beginning to realize the wisdom of an individualized approach to prescription for exercise, for activity, for anything really. Because when you get right down to it, you like a certain type of movie and maybe I like a different type of movie, and that's fine. And the same would apply when it comes to physical activity, or even, how important physical activity is as a dimension of overall health and well-being. To some people, it's not that important. That seems to be one of the presuppositions that a lot of people in the various health industries take for granted. The idea that everyone should put an absolute premium on health and physical activity and living as long as you can and that sort of thing. And even there, I think there's room for pluralism and preference.
Yes. Well, and I mean, I know I'm going to put you on the spot here, but
That's
I
okay.
think you have the answer. But what does sport? I'm always a fan of etymology and just that root language, the meaning. Um, what does sport mean? Like, where does this come from? The idea of sport.
Oh, great question. What does sport mean? And what's great about it is it could be any number of different questions. So
Mm,
that's part of what makes it difficult. One thing that it might mean, and we can talk about other things it might mean, is how to define sport. And philosophers are divided on the question of whether we should even be asking those questions anymore. Now, You cut your teeth philosophically on Plato and the ancient Greeks. So, yeah, they were all about definitions to get knowledge of the forms, these eternal essences. So there would be a form of sport. And I very much like that approach. Now, other people think it's not worth doing or you can't do it successfully. But a number of years ago, I published a definition of sport, which goes something like this. Sport is, geez, can I remember it? Give me a moment. Uh, Competitive games of inclusively gross physical skill. So not cooperative games, but competitive games. Gross physical skill, that's involving the whole body or major muscle groups. So you're controlling the whole body or you're moving the whole body rather than, say, playing pickup sticks or something. That wouldn't be sport because it's fine motor skill only. And I say inclusively because other elements can be significant outcome determiners. So you've got games, they're competitive, it involves physical skill, it's gross physical skill, the whole body's involved, and other elements can come in like strategy. You look at a sport like football, the outcomes, who wins and loses, will generally be co-determined by physical skill and strategy, who has the best combination or which side has the best combination of those. So that would be my definition of sport. But as to what sport means on a social level, on a personal level, on a subcultural level, it can mean anything from nothing to many people to absolutely everything for diehard fans or practitioners.
Yeah.
So
Where does it come? Like, what language does it derive from?
that is a great question, and I don't know.
That's okay. I'll figure it out as we're talking. That's why
Okay.
I love Google. But well, because I'm just asking that because um gymnasium comes from ancient Greek
Yes.
language,
Yes.
right? I think it's gymnos, if I
Okay.
remember correctly. Or Gymnos. I forget exactly, but I'll get that answer to sports, to the etymology. But like in the meantime, there's a lot of, you brought up ethics, and I'm not gonna let it go because I think there's so many essays in philosophy of sport in the collection that are controversial, are definitely timely, are important questions, especially now when it comes to the inclusion of transgender athletes, which has been so polarizing. But I think it's where we need philosophers like you, Jason. We need those from the humanities who aren't being turned to. And I feel like that is a lack in terms of these professional organizations. Like, why aren't they turning to philosophers to look into the ethics issues? And it can't, like, it's not an either or. Like, I feel like we're in this either or, like, either transgender athletes, like, carte blanche, go into a men's or a women's team, which again, we have binary gender teams. So that's a question about how are the binary gender teams working right now? Um, or do they go form their own team as a transgender team? But it's like, why are these our options? I find that there's not a lot of imagination happening, in my opinion. And to hear Jason's answer, you're gonna have to wait for part two, everyone. And he has a lot to say about LGBTQ inclusiveness in sporting culture, in athletic culture, also with Major League Sports right now. There's a lot that's going on around the ethics of transgender athletes. How do you be empathetic and possibly also recognize the biological differences that exist with the genders? And how do we think about that with transgender athletes? So there's so much he has to say about it, and he does it with such care, empathy, and with his philosophical mind. We talk more about performance enhancing drugs. I talk more about the gymnasium, and how its root is centered on nudity. ancient Greek athletics and how the Olympics that we currently see all can be traced back to ancient Greece. Jason was such a wonderful guest. I would love if you all share out this episode on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, or X now. I guess that's what we call it. Ivory Tower Boiler Room is where you can find us on social media. If you want to, record part of this episode, you want to record an audio clip, by all means, go for it. I absolutely love if you share out our podcast. Like maybe there's a certain moment you really want to share on social media. Please do it. I would absolutely love it. But mention us so I can share it out to everyone on our social media. Okay, so if you want to though listen to the full episode, it's on our Patreon. $5 a month gets you all of our full episodes. You don't have to wait for part 2. So Ivory Tower, it's patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Also, you can find a link to Jason's book in our show notes. Make sure that you use the code Ivory Tower on broadviewpress.com and you get 20% off. Okay, see you all next time in the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Thank you so much for listening to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. This is Andrew Rimby, the host and director of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room podcast. I am joined with Mary DePippi, our chief contributor and host of True Crime in Academia. Please, if you're not, make sure that you follow the Ivory Tower Boiler Room and True Crime in Academia on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok too. Remember our TikTok. That's where all the exciting video clips are posted. Make sure that you join our Patreon if you want more Ivory Tower Boiler Room and True Crime in Academia content. All the video interviews are on our Patreon. All of our bonus episodes are on Patreon. And it just means so much for you to join for $5 a month. You unlock all of our bonus episodes. And also, it just helps support the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Thank you so much for giving Mary and I a needed jolt of caffeine for coffee. Thanks for the $5. Head to patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. We cannot wait for you all to listen to our summer season. There are so many exciting episodes. And we're also celebrating 3 years of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room podcast. So, without further ado, thanks for listening. Make sure you listen to the next episode next week and have a wonderful summer season, everyone. Okay, bye now.